My name is Bella. I'm 34 years old, and until 11 months ago, I was the corporate pension trustee for a family business worth $6.2 million, a business my own sister tried to rob blind by forging my signature on a pension transfer form, forgetting one small detail. You cannot forge your way past the person who actually controls the trust. Disowned. That's the word my mother used the night she changed the locks on the house I grew up in. Disowned, while I was sitting on a $340,000 annual salary as head of pension governance for a regional actuarial firm, with my own trustee registration number and a signing authority that not one person in my family understood the weight of. I can still see the exact moment it started to unravel for her. October the 9th, 2024, 3:47 p.m. My sister Chloe sitting across from a bank compliance officer, sliding a transfer authorization form across a laminate table, her hand trembling just slightly, saying, "This is my sister's signature, she approved this, ask her yourself." And the compliance officer looking down at the form, then back up at Chloe, and saying 4 words that ended everything, "We already did that." I'm not going to tell you how we got to that room yet. I want you to sit with that image for a second. My little sister, the golden child, the one who got the car, the wedding, the she's just going through a lot excuses her entire life, sitting in a bank with a forged signature that had my name on it, about to find out that forging a signature and forging authority are 2 very different crimes. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from, and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and trust me, by the end of this story, you're going to want to comment again. Hit subscribe if you haven't, because this channel is where I tell the truth about what happens when a family assumes you'll always be the quiet one who cleans up the mess. Not this time. Let me take you back to where this really began, because you need to understand who I was before I understood who they were. I grew up in Millbrook Falls, a small town about 40 minutes outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in a narrow blue house on Larkspur Lane with green shutters that my father repainted every 3rd summer whether they needed it or not. My father, Gerald, ran a small manufacturing supply company called Cresmont Fastening Solutions, which he built from a single rented warehouse in 1988 into a business that, by the time I was in college, was turning over $2.8 million a year. My mother, Diane, kept the books in the early years before they could afford a real accountant, and something about growing up watching numbers move across yellow ledger paper on our kitchen table made me fall in love with the mechanics of money before I was even a teenager. Chloe is 2 years younger than me. From the time she was 6 years old, my mother called her my sunshine girl, and there is nothing wrong with a nickname, except that I never got one. I got the responsible one, which sounds like a compliment until you're 11 years old and you realize it means nobody is going to ask if you're okay, because you're the one who's supposed to make sure everyone else is. When I was 14, Chloe broke my grandmother's crystal candy dish, the one that sat on the mantel my whole childhood, and told my mother I did it. I remember the specific look on my mother's face, not anger, just this tired disappointment, like she'd expected it from me. I didn't even fight it. I just went to my room. That was the pattern for the next 20 years. Chloe broke things, sometimes literally, sometimes financially, sometimes emotionally, and I absorbed the consequences because it was easier than watching my mother's face fall. I was good at math in a way that made teachers nervous. By 16 I was doing my father's basic bookkeeping on weekends for $12 an hour, and by the time I left for Penn State to study actuarial science, I already understood defined benefit pension structures better than most of the accountants my father hired. I graduated in 2014, passed my first 2 actuarial exams within 18 months, and took a junior analyst position at Harrisburg Pension Partners, a mid-sized firm managing retirement structures for small and mid-cap private companies across central Pennsylvania. Chloe, meanwhile, dropped out of a business administration program at a community college twice, worked briefly at a boutique in King of Prussia, and moved back into our parents' house at 23 after a relationship ended badly. My parents never once called her irresponsible. They called it finding herself. When I moved back home for 4 months at 22 to save money before grad school, my mother made comments about freeloading within the first 2 weeks. By 2019, I'd earned my full actuarial credentials and was promoted to Senior Pension Trustee Administrator, which meant I now held formal fiduciary and signing authority over several of the firm's client pension trusts, meaning legally, my signature and my authorization were required for any material transfer, rollover, or disbursement from those trust accounts, and any attempt to bypass that authority constituted trust fraud under Pennsylvania fiduciary law. I mention that specific detail now because it matters more than anything else in this story. My father's business, Cresmont Fastening Solutions, had grown enough by 2018 that he finally set up a proper defined contribution pension trust for himself, my mother, and eventually Chloe when she came on part-time doing marketing, which mostly meant posting on the company's barely used Facebook page 3 times a month. When my father set the trust up, he did something that would end up being the single most important decision in this entire story. He asked me, his actuary daughter, to be the appointed independent trustee of record, separate from himself as the plan sponsor, because his insurance broker told him it looked better for compliance to have a licensed professional with no direct ownership stake overseeing it. My father thought he was doing something practical. He had no idea he was building the exact wall that would one day stop his own younger daughter from stealing from him. I want to be clear here, because this isn't a story about me being some kind of financial genius who saw the future coming. I said yes because my dad asked me, and because it was maybe 4 hours of paperwork a year. I didn't think about it again for a long time. I just did my job, reviewed the quarterly statements, signed off on contribution matching, made sure Cresmont stayed compliant with ERISA reporting standards, and went back to my actual career. Life moved forward the way it does. I got engaged in 2021 to a man named Marcus, a structural engineer I met through a mutual friend, steady and quiet in a way that felt like relief after growing up in a house where quiet always meant something was wrong. My parents liked him fine, in the distant way they liked most things about my life, acknowledged, rarely celebrated. The trigger, the moment that changed everything, happened on August 3, 2023, at my parents' anniversary dinner at a restaurant called Thornbury Steakhouse just outside Harrisburg. Chloe had gotten herself into debt, not small debt, $61,000 across 2 credit cards and a personal loan she'd taken out to fund a business, which turned out to be a candle company that sold maybe $4,000 worth of product before quietly disappearing from Instagram. My parents wanted me to co-sign a $75,000 home equity line of credit against their house so Chloe could consolidate the debt and, in my mother's words, get a fresh start. I said no. Not out of cruelty. I'd watched Chloe get bailed out financially at least 4 times since she turned 18, and every single time it delayed the moment she'd actually have to learn to manage money, while our parents' own retirement security got thinner each time. I told them, calmly, at that table, that I loved Chloe but I wasn't going to put my name on a debt instrument that put our parents' house at risk for a business that had already failed once. I offered instead to help Chloe build an actual budget and find a credit counselor. My mother's fork went down on her plate with a sound I still hear sometimes. So you'll help her with a spreadsheet, she said, but not with the thing that would actually save her. My father didn't say much that night. He never did. But 3 weeks later, on August 24, 2023, at 6:15 p.m., I got a call from my mother. Her voice was flat in a way I'd never heard before. She said, "We've been talking, and we think it's best if you take some space from this family for a while. You clearly don't feel like part of it anyway." I remember standing in my kitchen, one hand on the counter, and asking her what that meant, practically, and she said, "It means don't come to Thanksgiving." Then she hung up. I didn't cry. I want to say that clearly, because I know what people expect from this part of the story. I stood in my kitchen for maybe 10 minutes, and then I made tea, because my hands needed something to do. Marcus came home 40 minutes later and found me sitting at the table with a full, cold cup in front of me, and I just said, "I think my mother disowned me over the phone." He didn't say anything dramatic. He just sat down, put his hand over mine, and said, "Then we build something better than what they had." The rupture didn't end there, though. Chloe texted me 2 days later, "Mom told me what you did. I hope the moral high ground keeps you warm." I didn't respond. My father called once, on September 2nd, and when I picked up, he said, "Your mother's really hurt, Bells. Maybe give her some time." I asked him directly if he agreed with what she'd said, if he thought I should be cut off for refusing to co-sign a loan. There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear the television in the background, and then he said, I don't want to get in the middle of it. That was, in its own way, an answer. I want to tell you about Marcus's mother here, because she became something I didn't know I needed. Her name was Renata, a retired hospital administrator, sharp-eyed and unsentimental in the best way. About a month after the estrangement started, she invited me over for dinner, just the two of us, Marcus working late. She didn't tell me my family was wrong, or that I should reconcile, or any of the things people say when they don't know what to say. She just asked me questions about my work, actually listened to the answers, and at one point, when I mentioned offhand that I was still technically the trustee on my father's company pension, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Bella, do you understand what that means? Do you understand the power that gives you, whether you asked for it or not?" I told her I hadn't really thought about it. She said, "You should. Not to use it against anyone. Just so you understand your own position." I didn't know yet how right she'd turn out to be. The next year and a half were quiet in a way that still surprises me when I look back on it. Not peaceful, exactly, but quiet. My parents didn't call. Chloe didn't call, except once around Christmas 2023 to ask if I'd come to my senses, which I didn't answer. I threw myself into work instead. I was promoted again in March 2024 to Director of Fiduciary Compliance, overseeing trust governance for 11 client accounts, including, still, because no one had ever formally removed me, Cresmont Fastening Solutions Pension Trust, the one my father had asked me to steward 5 years earlier and apparently never updated. Marcus and I got married in a small ceremony in June 2024. 52 guests, none of them my parents or my sister. Renata walked me partway down the aisle, which is a detail I still can't think about without my throat tightening, not from sadness anymore, but from gratitude. My own mother sent nothing. Not a card, not a message. My father, 3 weeks later, sent a single text. Heard congratulations were in order. Hope you're well. I stared at that message for a long time before I decided not to answer it either. By the fall of 2024, my salary had climbed to $340,000 a year including bonuses. Marcus and I had bought a house in a neighborhood called Fairview Ridge, and I genuinely believed I had built a life that no longer needed anything from Millbrook Falls. I want to be honest with you. I still thought about my family. I still, some nights, replayed that dinner at Thornbury Steakhouse and wondered if there was a version where I'd said yes and none of this happened. But I never regretted the no. I regretted, sometimes, how much it cost. Those are different things. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that Cresmont Fastening Solutions had quietly started struggling that same year. A major supplier contract fell through in the spring. My father, now 63, and slower than he used to be, had made 2 bad inventory decisions in a row. And Chloe, 32 years old, still working part-time marketing for the company, had gotten access to something she didn't fully understand and desperately needed to touch. The pension account with $340,000 sitting inside it, accumulated over 16 years, that she believed, wrongly, that she could quietly move. She had no idea I was still the trustee of record. She had no idea that every transfer request over $10,000 required a secondary authorization that ran, automatically, through the fiduciary compliance software at my own firm. She had no idea that the woman she'd helped push out of the family, the responsible one, the one who got a spreadsheet instead of a signature, was the exact person standing between her and that money. That October morning, when Chloe walked into the bank with a form bearing a signature she'd copied off an old birthday card I'd once signed, she thought she was closing a door on a story that had already ended 11 months earlier. She had no idea she was about to open one she couldn't control. The compliance officer who caught it was a woman named Priya Anand, mid-30s, meticulous, someone I'd worked with twice before on unrelated trust audits. She told me later, over the phone, in the clipped professional tone she used for everything, that the moment she pulled up the authorization chain on the Cresmont pension account and saw my name flagged as trustee of record, she knew immediately something was wrong, because the signature on Chloe's form didn't match the signature specimen on file in a single meaningful way. The loop on the B was wrong, closed instead of open. The kind of detail a forger copying from an old birthday card would never think to notice. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me take you through how we actually got there, because the 11 months between the rupture and that bank compliance office were not empty months. They were building months, whether I realized it at the time or not. Year 1. That's how I've come to think about it. The way you'd mark time in a ledger rather than a calendar. Year 1 of the silence started in September 2023 and, if I'm honest, it started with a strange kind of grief that didn't look like the grief you see in movies. I didn't cry every day. I didn't fall apart. What I did was start a folder. I didn't plan it, not consciously. It began the week after my mother's phone call, when I printed out the text messages from Chloe and my father and put them in a plain manila folder in my desk drawer at home, the same drawer where I kept my passport and Marcus's car title. I told myself it was nothing, just tidiness, the same instinct that made me alphabetize my spice rack. But by November, the folder had a name on the tab in my own handwriting. Family. By January 2024, it had become a binder, 3-ring, navy blue, with dividers. I want you to remember that binder. It matters later. Inside it went everything. Screenshots of Chloe's Christmas text. A printout of my father's "Hope you're well" message after the wedding, dated and timestamped. Copies of every quarterly Cresmont pension statement I'd continued to review and sign off on as trustee, because even estranged from the family, I had never once neglected my fiduciary duty to that trust. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. I wasn't protecting them out of love in that moment. I was protecting my own license, my own name, my own 12 years of professional integrity. But it meant that unlike almost every other part of my relationship with my family, that one thread never went dark. I kept doing the job. Quietly, without a single thank you, I kept 16 years of my father's retirement savings compliant and accounted for while he wasn't speaking to me. If you've ever gone through something like this, a slow separation from people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, you know that the hardest part isn't the day it happens. It's the 6-month mark, when the shock wears off and you're just left with the shape of the absence. If this is hitting close to home for anyone watching, go ahead and drop a comment. I promise you, you're not the only one who's had to build a family binder instead of a family. Work became the place I put everything that used to go toward Millbrook Falls. In January 2024, I sat for and passed my fellowship exam with the Society of Actuaries, a credential that took most of my colleagues 4 to 6 additional years and that I finished in under 3 because I simply didn't have anywhere else to put my evenings. My firm, Harrisburg Pension Partners, promoted me to Director of Fiduciary Compliance in March, a role that came with an $80,000 raise and oversight of 11 client trust accounts, Cresmont still quietly among them. My new office had a window facing the small courtyard behind the building, and I remember standing at that window the day I got the promotion letter, thinking about how my mother used to say I'd never really go anywhere with actuarial work, that it was just numbers, and feeling nothing but a strange, flat calm. Not triumph. Just fact settling into place. Marcus, meanwhile, made partner-track progress at his engineering firm and picked up a structural consulting contract on a mixed-use development outside Lancaster that alone brought in $58,000 over 8 months. Between the two of us, our combined household income crossed $520,000 for the first time in 2024, the same year we closed on the house in Fairview Ridge, 4 bedrooms, a detached office where I eventually did most of my compliance review work on weekends, a kitchen with the kind of marble countertop my mother used to point at in magazines and call impractical for a real family. I thought about that comment more than once while I stood at that counter making coffee at 6 in the morning before work. Renata, Marcus's mother, became something between a mentor and the mother I hadn't chosen but somehow ended up with anyway. She had this habit of calling every Sunday at exactly 11 in the morning, not to check on me exactly, just to talk, ask about a case I was working on, tell me about a book she was reading. In March 2024 she gave me a small leather-bound daily planner for my birthday, and inside the front cover she'd written, in her sharp, upright handwriting, "You were never the problem. You were just the only one paying attention." I still have that planner. I still read that line some mornings. The silence from Millbrook Falls wasn't total, though, and that's important, because total silence is easier to survive than the specific, occasional cruelty of almost contact. In April 2024, my mother sent me a single text, no context, just a photo of a card I'd made her in 3rd grade that she'd apparently found while cleaning a closet, with the caption "Found this today. No, I miss you. No, let's talk. Just a photograph, like a test to see if I'd bite. I didn't respond, and I remember Marcus asking if that was hard, and me realizing it wasn't, not really. It was almost clarifying, a small confirmation that nothing fundamental had changed on their end. In June 2024, we got married. I described that day to you already, the 52 guests, Renata walking me partway down the aisle in place of the mother who wasn't there, my father's delayed and hollow text 3 weeks later. What I didn't tell you is that Chloe found out about the wedding not from me, but from a mutual cousin's Facebook post, and texted me that same week. Cool, guess I wasn't invited to my own sister's wedding. Nice. I didn't respond to that either, though I'll admit I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time considering it. The old version of me, the responsible one, the fixer, would have called her immediately to smooth it over, to explain, to apologize even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I didn't. That, more than the promotion, more than the house, felt like the real marker of year 1 ending and year 2 beginning. I had stopped performing the apology reflex. Year 2, 2024 into 2025, was quieter still, but it was also the year Cresmont Fastening Solutions started to come apart at the seams, though I didn't know the details yet, only fragments. My father's business had run for 36 years on a handful of long-term supplier and distributor relationships, and in April 2024 one of the largest, a regional hardware distribution chain called Yorkfield Supply Company, restructured its vendor contracts and cut Cresmont's order volume by nearly 40%. I only know this now because of what came out later, but at the time, all I got was a second-hand comment from my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, who I still spoke to occasionally, that your dad's had a rough year with the business, but you know him, he doesn't like to talk about it. I want to be honest about something here. Part of me, a small, human, imperfect part, felt a flicker of vindication when I heard that. Not happiness at my father's struggle, I want to be clear about that, but a kind of grim confirmation that maybe the family that told me my no to co-signing Chloe's loan was some kind of betrayal might now understand, in their own time, what it actually looks like to make financially reckless decisions without the person who'd spent her whole life quietly managing the fallout. I'm not proud of that flicker. I'm also not going to pretend it wasn't there. By late 2024, Chloe, 32, still nominally employed by Cresmont in a vague marketing coordinator role that I later learned paid her $46,000 a year for what amounted to roughly 6 hours of actual work weekly, had accumulated new debt on top of the old. The original $61,000 had ballooned with interest and 2 additional credit lines to nearly $89,000 by December 2024. My aunt mentioned, again in passing, that Chloe had asked my parents for help again, and that my father had told her, for the first time in her life as far as I knew, that there simply wasn't more to give. The business was tight. The house had a second mortgage against it now, taken out in early 2024, the very kind of instrument I'd refused to co-sign 18 months earlier. Except this time my parents had done it without me, alone, and it hadn't solved anything either. I only found out about that second mortgage months later, through documents that came into my possession in circumstances I'll tell you about in the next part. But I'm telling you now because it matters. My parents took on the exact risk I'd refused to help create, on their own, to bail out Chloe again, and it still wasn't enough. The house I grew up in, the blue one with green shutters on Larkspur Lane, now had 2 liens against it. In January 2025, something shifted that I didn't understand the significance of until much later. Harrisburg Pension Partners was profiled in a regional business journal, Central PA Business Quarterly, for our firm's growth in fiduciary compliance services, and I was quoted directly in the piece, identified by name and title. Bella, redacted, Director of Fiduciary Compliance. The article mentioned, among other things, that I'd overseen governance for pension trusts collectively valued at over $40 million across client accounts. It was a trade publication, not exactly viral content, but it was searchable. It had my photo. It had my salary bracket implied through my title and the firm's public compensation bands, which had been reported the year before in a separate piece about actuarial talent retention in the region. I didn't send that article to anyone in my family. I didn't even think about them when it was published. I was proud of it in the ordinary, private way you're proud of professional milestones, and I posted it once on LinkedIn, nothing more. But LinkedIn posts don't stay contained the way you think they will. My cousin Danielle, Aunt Carol's daughter, someone I was still friendly with, liked the post. And Danielle, I would later learn, was still in a group chat with my mother and Chloe called Family Updates, a chat I'd been quietly removed from sometime in the fall of 2023 without anyone telling me directly. I'd simply stopped receiving messages one day and understood what had happened. In February 2025, my aunt mentioned, almost as an afterthought during a call about something else entirely, that your mom saw that article about you, you know. The one about the pension company. I asked what she'd said about it. My aunt paused in that particular way people pause when they're deciding how much to protect you from, and said, she didn't say much. But I think it surprised her. I don't think she realized you were doing that well. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Not with anger, exactly. Something closer to a strange, weary recognition that after everything, after the silence and the missed wedding and the folder that had grown into a binder in my drawer, the first real crack in that silence wasn't going to come from love or apology or missing me. It was going to come from money. From the fact that I had become, without meaning to, visibly successful in a way my family could no longer dismiss as just numbers. I didn't know yet how right that instinct would turn out to be. I didn't know that 4 months later, in June 2025, Chloe would sit across from a bank compliance officer with a form bearing my forged signature, believing that the sister who'd once been too responsible to be interesting was still the same quiet, absorbing, conflict-avoidant woman who used to take the blame for a broken crystal candy dish just to keep the peace. She had no idea that the woman in that Central PA Business Quarterly article, the one overseeing $40 million in trust governance, the one who now had a fiduciary duty backed by state law and a compliance system that flagged irregular authorizations automatically, was the same person. She thought she was dealing with her sister. She was actually dealing with the trustee of record. That spring, in April 2025, I got the first direct contact from my father in nearly a year and a half. Not a text this time, but a voicemail, left at 9:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, his voice rougher than I remembered it. Bella, it's Dad. I know it's been a while. Things have been complicated here. I was hoping we could talk sometime. No pressure. Just call me when you get a chance. I saved that voicemail. I didn't call him back right away. I sat with it for 11 days, the way I'd learned to sit with everything from that family now, letting the first reflexive instinct pass before deciding what, if anything, I owed a response. I didn't know it yet, but that voicemail was the beginning of part 3 of this story. The part where my family came back, not for me, but for what I'd become, and where I'd finally understand exactly what they were planning to do about it. I called my father back on a Sunday morning, the 15th of April, 2025, sitting at the marble counter he used to call impractical, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me exactly the way it had the night my mother disowned me. He picked up on the second ring, like he'd been waiting with the phone in his hand, which, knowing him now, he probably had been. Bella. Just my name, said like he was testing whether it still worked between us. Hi, Dad. We talked for 11 minutes. I know because I looked at the call timer after we hung up, an old habit from billing hours in my early actuarial years, tracking time the way other people track feelings. He asked about Marcus. He asked, carefully, almost sideways, about the promotion he'd apparently heard about from Aunt Carol. He did not ask about the wedding he missed, or the year and a half of silence, or the phone call where my mother told me not to come to Thanksgiving. He talked around all of it the way you walk around a hole in the floor without acknowledging it's there. Near the end of the call, he said, "Your mother's not great these days. Business has been rough. I think she'd like to see you." Not I would like to see you. Not I miss you. She would like to see you. I noticed the distance in that sentence and didn't say anything about it, because by then I'd learned that pointing out the gap between what my family said and what they meant rarely changed anything except my own blood pressure. I told him I'd think about it. I meant it, too, though not in the way he probably hoped. What I actually thought about, over the following weeks, was the binder in my desk drawer, now thick enough that the ring strained slightly when I closed it, and the strange, cold clarity I'd developed about my own family over 18 months of silence. I'd stopped being the girl who needed their approval to feel whole. What I hadn't stopped being was curious, in the specific, professional way that comes from a decade of reading financial statements for a living, about what exactly had changed on their end to make my father leave that voicemail after 530-some days of nothing. I didn't have to wonder for long. If you've ever watched a family rediscover you right around the same time your bank balance became visible to them, you already know how this part goes. So if that's you, go ahead and drop a comment, because part 4 is going to feel like vindication for a lot of you. The first real crack came in May 2025, 3 weeks after my father's call, when my cousin Danielle reached out to me directly for the first time in over a year, not through Aunt Carol, not through some family intermediary, but with a text of her own. "Hey, this is going to sound weird, but I think you should know something. Don't tell your mom I told you." Attached to the text was a screenshot, slightly cropped at the edges the way screenshots are when someone's hand is shaking a little while they take them, of the family updates group chat I'd been quietly removed from in the fall of 2023. I want to describe that screenshot to you in detail, because I've looked at it more times than I can count since, and every time I notice something new. The chat name at the top, Family Updates, the same cheerful blue bubble my mother had named it back when I was still in it. Back when it used to be full of photos of Sunday dinners and updates about Chloe's candle business launches. The messages Danielle had captured started mid-conversation, my mother's name, Diane, in bold above a message timestamped 8:52 p.m. on May 9, 2025. I looked her firm up online. Director of Fiduciary Compliance. That article said she oversees 40 million in trust accounts. She makes more than your father and I combined probably. Below that, Chloe, 8:54 p.m. So she's basically swimming in it and we're about to lose the house. Below that, my mother again, 8:57 p.m. She's still trustee on your father's plan. I don't think anyone ever took her off it. Maybe that's actually useful. I read that last line more times than I want to admit. She's still trustee on your father's plan. Maybe that's actually useful. Not, maybe we should apologize to her. Not, maybe we should reach out because we miss her. Useful. That was the word my own mother used to describe her estranged daughter's professional standing. In a group chat she'd made sure to keep me out of specifically so I wouldn't see conversations exactly like this one. I didn't respond to Danielle right away. I sat with the screenshot open on my phone for a long time. The way you sit with a diagnosis before you decide what to do about it. Then I did something that surprised even me. I forwarded the screenshot to my own email, timestamped it, and printed it, 3 copies, and slid one into the binder in my desk drawer, right behind the Christmas text from Chloe and the hope you're well message from my father. I didn't know yet exactly what I'd need it for. I just knew, in the same instinct that made me build that binder in the first place, that I would need it for something. Marcus found me still sitting at the counter an hour later, the phone face down beside my coffee, and asked what was wrong before I'd said a single word, because apparently I have a very specific stillness that gives me away. I showed him the screenshot. He read it twice, silently, and then said the thing that ended up anchoring me for the rest of that summer. "They're not sorry, Bella. They're solvent adjacent. There's a difference, and you already know it." I laughed, a short, surprised sound, because it was exactly the kind of dry, precise thing his mother would have said, and I realized in that moment how much of my new family, the one I'd built rather than been born into, had started shaping the way I thought about the old one. I want to pause here and tell you something I didn't fully understand about myself until that week in May. For 18 months, I had told people, told Marcus, told Renata, even told myself, that I'd made peace with the estrangement, that I no longer needed anything from Millbrook Falls. And mostly that was true. But reading that screenshot, seeing my own mother describe me in a private conversation as useful rather than missed, cracked something open that I'd thought was already fully healed. Not because I wanted her love back on any terms. Because some small, stubborn part of me had still been holding out hope that if they ever did come back, it would be for me. It wasn't. It was for the trust. I let myself grieve that specific, narrow loss for exactly one evening, sitting on the back deck with a glass of wine I barely touched, and then I decided grief wasn't going to be useful for whatever was coming next, so I put it away and got practical instead. That same week, I did something I'd been circling for months without quite admitting it to myself. I called an attorney. Her name was Renata's referral, actually, Not Marcus's mother herself, but a colleague of hers from her hospital administration days who'd since become a trusts and estates litigator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Farah Orconquareyes, who worked out of a small but well-regarded firm in downtown Harrisburg. I sat in her office on May 22, 2025, and told her everything. The trustee appointment from 2019, the estrangement, the group chat screenshot, the second mortgage I'd learned about secondhand, my father's sudden voicemail after 18 months of silence. Farah listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys do, taking notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting almost as sharp as her questions. When I finished, she set her pen down and said something I've thought about constantly since. Bella, you need to understand the position you're actually in, because I don't think you fully do yet. You are not just a family member who happens to know about their finances. You are the legally appointed fiduciary of record on a $340,000 pension trust. That means you have not just permission, but an active legal duty to protect that trust from any unauthorized activity, even, and I want to be very clear about this, especially from family members. If anyone attempts to move funds out of that trust without your explicit authorization, that's not a family dispute. That's trust fraud, and depending on the dollar amount, it could rise to a federal offense under ERISA. I remember asking her what would happen if, hypothetically, someone in my family tried to forge my authorization on a transfer. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that told me she suspected I wasn't asking hypothetically, and said, then you'd have grounds to report it immediately, and depending on intent and amount, they could be looking at both civil liability to the trust and potential criminal charges for forgery and attempted fraud. I'd also strongly recommend, given everything you've told me, that you request updated authentication protocols on the account, a secondary verification step, so that any attempted transfer over a certain threshold requires direct confirmation from you personally, by phone or in person, not just a signature that could be replicated from an old document. I followed her advice within the week. I didn't tell my father why. I simply called Cresmont's plan administrator, a man named Walter Griggs who'd worked with my father for over a decade, and requested the additional authentication layer, citing standard compliance best practice. He didn't ask questions. He just implemented it. I want you to remember that step, because it's the exact reason the compliance officer, Priya, caught Chloe's forgery within minutes instead of it slipping through. Farah's office smelled faintly of the eucalyptus reed diffuser sitting on the corner of her bookshelf, and I remember focusing on that small, ordinary detail while she pulled the actual trust documents up on her monitor, cross-referencing the language my father's insurance broker had used back in 2019 when he first named me trustee. This is airtight, she said, turning the screen slightly so I could see it too. Your father, whether he understood it fully at the time or not, gave you sole discretionary authority over disbursements above the routine contribution threshold. That's not ceremonial. That's real power, and it's yours alone, regardless of what your family situation looks like on a personal level. She tapped the clause with the end of her pen. People think estrangement erases legal relationships. It doesn't. You are still, on paper, exactly who you were before any of this happened. That's actually your advantage here, not your burden. I left her office that day with a manila folder of my own, mirroring the one that had started this whole documentation habit almost 2 years earlier, except this one had a letterhead and a retainer agreement inside it instead of printed text messages. Walking to my car in the parking garage, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet, not vindication exactly, but a kind of settled ground beneath my feet. For 18 months I had been reactive, absorbing what my family did or didn't do, waiting to see what shape their silence or their return would take. For the first time, I had a plan of my own that didn't depend on anything they said or did next. Through June 2025, the reconnect ion attempts from my family accelerated in a way that, looking back, followed a pattern so obvious I almost feel foolish for not seeing it sooner in real time. Though I did see it, I just chose to watch it play out rather than shut it down early. My mother texted me on June 4th, thinking of you. Hope you and Marcus are doing well. Would love to catch up sometime. No mention of the 17 months of silence. No mention of Thanksgiving, or the wedding, or the voicemail. Just would love to catch up, like we were old co-workers who'd drifted apart naturally instead of a mother who'd told her daughter to stay away. I responded, carefully, 3 days later. I'm doing well. Happy to talk if you want to actually talk. I underlined actually in my head, if not on the screen, curious whether she'd noticed the challenge in it. She didn't. She called 2 days after that, on June 9th, and the conversation was almost entirely surface. My job, Marcus's job, a passing mention of things being tight with the business right now, your father's stressed, followed, 16 minutes in, by the line I'd been waiting for without fully admitting I was waiting for it. You know, since we're talking again, maybe you could come by the house sometime. See how everyone's doing. Your father would really like that. Chloe too. Chloe too. I noted that specifically, because Chloe had not texted me once, not since the Christmas message 18 months earlier calling my restraint the moral high ground. My mother was speaking for her, the way she'd spoken for Chloe my entire life, and it was in that moment, sitting on my back deck in Fairview Ridge with the phone against my ear, that I understood with total clarity this wasn't reconciliation. This was reconnaissance, dressed up in the language of family. I agreed to visit. Farah had actually advised against total avoidance. She told me, in her direct way, if they're circling, sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let them get close enough to show you their hand. So on June 21st, 2025, a Saturday, I drove the 40 minutes back to Millbrook Falls for the first time in nearly 2 years, back to the narrow blue house on Larkspur Lane, the green shutters slightly more faded than I remembered, one of them hanging a degree off level in a way my father would never have tolerated in healthier years. The visit itself was almost theatrically ordinary on the surface. My mother had made a pot roast, my childhood favorite, a detail I clocked immediately as calculated rather than coincidental. My father hugged me at the door, longer than I expected, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly despite everything, because some part of me, no matter how much armor I'd built over 18 months, still wanted her father back, uncomplicated, the way he used to be before all of this. Chloe was there too, sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, and she stood up, hesitated, then hugged me stiffly, saying, "It's been forever," like the distance between us had been weather rather than her own silence. But underneath the pot roast and the hugs, I watched things happen that Farah's advice had trained me to notice. My mother, halfway through dinner, mentioned almost too casually that she'd seen photos of our house in Fairview Ridge online. Marcus's firm had done a small feature on their website about the mixed-use development he'd consulted on, and apparently included a photo from a company event held at our house the previous fall. "It looks beautiful, Bella. 4 bedrooms. That's a lot of space for just the 2 of you." I said yes, we liked having the room. She let it sit there for a moment too long before moving to the next question, which was, with almost no transition at all, about my car. I'd driven the Audi that day instead of Marcus's truck. "Is that new?" she asked. It wasn't, I'd had it 2 years, but I understood the real question wasn't about the car's age. After dinner, Chloe asked to see the pictures on my phone from the wedding, a request that felt less like genuine interest and more like an opening, and while scrolling, she asked, seemingly offhand, "Do you still do that trustee thing for Dad's company? The pension stuff?" I told her yes, I still oversaw it, same as always. She nodded, too quickly, and changed the subject to something about Marcus's job, but I saw her eyes flick toward my father across the room, a brief, silent exchange that told me everything Farah had warned me to watch for. They were not curious about my life. They were assessing what I had, and whether I still held the specific piece of leverage, trustee authority over $340,000 they could no longer access any other way, that would let them solve a problem I still didn't know the full scope of yet. My mother, clearing plates, asked one more question before I left that evening. One that on its surface sounded like small talk but that I turned over in my mind the entire drive home. Does your firm handle situations where, I don't know, hypothetically, a family business needed to access retirement funds early? For an emergency? I told her, truthfully, that early distributions were possible under specific hardship provisions but came with significant tax penalties and required documented proof of qualifying hardship, and that any distribution above a certain threshold would need to go through me directly as trustee, in person, with full documentation. I watched her face while I said it, the way you watch a client's face when you're delivering numbers they don't want to hear, and I saw something flicker there, disappointment, maybe, or recalculation, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Just curious, she said, too lightly, and went back to the dishes. Driving home that night down the same 2-lane road I'd taken 1,000 times as a teenager, past the Millbrook Falls water tower and the diner where my father used to take Chloe and me for pancakes on Saturday mornings, back when things were simpler, or at least felt that way, I found myself doing something I hadn't expected. I started mentally cataloguing the visit the way I would catalogue evidence in a compliance audit, not out of coldness, but out of the same instinct for order that had built the binder in the first place. The comment about the 4 bedrooms. The question about the car. The pot roast, my favorite, deployed like a strategic asset. The hypothetical about hardship distributions that wasn't hypothetical at all. Every piece slotted into place with an almost mechanical clarity, and by the time I pulled into my own driveway in Fairview Ridge, I understood exactly what kind of conversation I was going to eventually have to have with my family, whether I wanted to or not. I found out that scope 11 days later, on July 2nd, 2025, in the most unglamorous way possible. My father's phone, left face up on the kitchen counter during a second visit I made alone, to drop off a birthday gift for him a week early since Marcus and I would be traveling on his actual birthday. A text notification lit up while I was standing there waiting for him to come back from the garage, from a number saved as Yorkfield Supply, Rick, and the preview read, "Gerald, final notice. If the outstanding balance of $187,000 isn't settled by August 15th, we're pursuing legal action and terminating the account permanently. Please call me." I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. I'd seen enough in 6 seconds to understand that Cresmont wasn't just tight, the word my mother had used. It was drowning, $187,000 in arrears to their largest remaining supplier, on top of 2 mortgages against the house, on top of Chloe's now nearly 6-figure personal debt, and the only asset left in the family that hadn't already been leveraged, borrowed against, or spent was a pension trust worth $340,000 that required my signature to touch. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before going inside, doing the math the way I'd been trained to do math my entire adult life, except this time the equation wasn't about actuarial tables or discount rates. It was simple, and it was ugly. My family was roughly $470,000 in combined debt and obligations, with no clear path to cover it, and the only remaining pool of money large enough to matter was one I alone controlled. I told Marcus everything that night, and then I called Farah first thing the following morning. She was quiet for a moment after I finished, then said, "Bella, I think it's time we get ahead of this instead of just watching it happen. I want you to formally document everything, the visits, the phone left on the counter, the group chat screenshot, all of it, and I want you to be prepared, because if they're this deep in debt, they are going to come at you directly, and probably soon, and it likely won't be gentle." She was right. On the morning of August 6, 2025, a group text arrived. My mother, my father, and Chloe all included this time, the first time all 3 of them had addressed me together since the estrangement began nearly 2 years earlier. It read simply, "We need to talk about the business. Can we come by this weekend? It's important." I looked at that message for a long time, sitting at the same marble counter where this entire second chapter of my life with them had started, and I felt something settle into place that was less anger than resolve. I typed back 4 words. "This Saturday works fine." I didn't tell them what I already knew was coming. I didn't tell them about the binder, now nearly 3 inches thick, sitting in my desk drawer with every piece of evidence organized by date. I didn't tell them Farah had already drafted a formal letter documenting the enhanced authentication protocol on the trust account, dated and time-stamped weeks before this conversation had even been requested, so that if anything happened, the record would show I'd protected that trust long before I had any reason to suspect exactly what they'd try. I didn't tell them that I already understood, with total clarity, that whatever they were about to ask me for that Saturday, the real ask, underneath the words, was going to be the pension. I spent that week doing something my mother would never have expected from the daughter she'd once called too responsible to be interesting. I got ready. Not with anger, and not with revenge in my heart, no matter what it might have looked like from the outside. I got ready the way I'd been trained to get ready for every audit, every compliance review, every high-stakes trust dispute I'd ever handled professionally, calm, documented, and absolutely certain of my legal ground. Saturday, August 9th, 2025, 11:47 a.m. I was standing in my kitchen when I heard my father's truck turn into the driveway, followed a moment later by my mother's sedan, both cars arriving within a minute of each other like they'd coordinated it, which, knowing them, they had. I watched through the window as all three of them got out, my father moving slower than I remembered, my mother clutching a folder of her own against her chest, and Chloe hanging back slightly behind them, the way she always did when she wasn't sure how a room was going to receive her. I opened the front door before they reached it. "Come in," I said. "Let's talk about the business." "Come in," I said. "Let's talk about the business." They filed into my living room the way people file into a doctor's office when they already suspect the diagnosis, my father first, then my mother, then Chloe hanging back near the doorway like she wasn't sure she was actually welcome, which, if I'm honest, she wasn't entirely wrong to wonder. I offered them coffee out of habit more than hospitality, and only my father accepted, wrapping both hands around the mug the way he used to when I was a kid and he'd come in from the cold warehouse on winter mornings. My mother didn't wait for small talk. She never had patience for it when something mattered more, and I'd forgotten, in 2 years apart, how quickly she could get to the point when the point was money. "Bella, I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that." She set the folder she'd been clutching on my coffee table without opening it. "The business is in serious trouble. We're behind on payments to Yorkfield. We took a second mortgage on the house last year that we can barely service, and Chloe has debts of her own that have gotten out of hand. We need $340,000. We need it from the pension trust, and we need you to authorize it." There it was. 18 months of silence, one voicemail, one group chat I was never supposed to see, one dinner with a pot roast and pointed questions about my square footage, all of it collapsing into a single sentence in my own living room. I felt strangely calm hearing it out loud, the way you feel calm reading a diagnosis you'd already privately arrived at yourself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even feel the urge to. "That's the entire trust," I said. "Every dollar in it. For all three of you, combined, across 16 years of contributions." "We know what it is, Bella," my father said, quieter than my mother, not meeting my eyes. "We wouldn't ask if we had another option." "You do have another option," I said. "You could sell the second property on Route 9 you've been leasing out for storage. You could restructure the business debt with a workout agreement instead of raiding your own retirement. You could have Chloe get a second job to pay down what she owes instead of asking me to liquidate 16 years of your savings to cover it." I kept my voice level the entire time, the same voice I used in client meetings when I had to deliver numbers nobody wanted to hear. "I'm not saying no because I want to hurt you. I'm saying no because as trustee, I have a legal duty to protect that trust, including protecting it from decisions that would leave you both with nothing at 63 and 61 years old." Chloe, who had been silent by the door, finally spoke, and her voice had an edge I recognized from childhood, the specific tone she used right before things got ugly. "Of course you're saying no. You've been saying no our whole lives. You said no to co-signing my loan, you said no to helping when we actually needed you, and now you're going to say no to this too, while you sit in your 4-bedroom house with your Audi and your $340,000 salary." She said the number like an accusation, and I realized, with a strange detached clarity, that she'd clearly done her own math on my income at some point, probably from that same Business Journal article that had started all of this. "I said no to co-signing a loan for a candle business that failed in 4 months, I said, still calm. "I said no because saying yes wouldn't have fixed anything. It would have just delayed the reckoning by a year and put Mom and Dad's house at risk in the process. And I was right, because 2 years later, you're still in debt, and now it's worse." "That's not fair," my mother said, her voice climbing for the first time. "You have no idea what it's like to watch your daughter struggle." "I have some idea," I said. "I watched it for 32 years. I just wasn't the daughter you were watching struggle. I was the one who was supposed to fix it." The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence I'd lived in for the past 18 months. That silence had been absence. This one was confrontation, thick and immediate, and I let it sit there for a moment before my father spoke again, his voice lower, almost pleading in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Bella, please. This isn't about old arguments. The business is going to fail. We could lose the house. I'm asking you, as your father, to help us one more time. I want to tell you that this was the moment I felt nothing, that I'd become some cold, calculating version of myself immune to my own father asking for help with real fear in his voice. That would be a lie, and I promised myself I'd tell this story honestly. I felt it. I felt the pull of 34 years of wanting to fix things for people who never once fixed anything for me. But underneath that pull was something steadier now. Something Renata's Sunday calls and Farah's careful legal language and 18 months of building a life without them had put there. I understood, finally, completely, that helping them liquidate their entire retirement to cover debts they'd created without me wasn't love. It was just the same pattern with higher stakes. I love you, Dad, I said, and I meant it, even then. But I'm not authorizing that transfer. Not because I don't care what happens to you, but because I do. Emptying that trust doesn't save the business. It just delays the collapse by a few months and leaves you with nothing when it happens anyway. My mother stood up abruptly, gathering the folder she'd never even opened. So that's it. You're really going to let us lose everything. You're going to lose things because of decisions you made without me, I said. I'm not the one who took out a second mortgage. I'm not the one who let Chloe run up 6 figures in debt 3 separate times. I didn't do this. I'm just the person who's finally refusing to absorb the consequences of it. They left 20 minutes later, my father's goodbye barely audible, my mother not saying one at all, Chloe pausing at the door just long enough to say, "You're going to regret this," before following them out. I stood at the window and watched both cars back out of my driveway, and I want to be honest with you, I did cry that night, but not the way you might expect. Not from guilt. From the specific, particular grief of watching people you love choose, again, to protect their own comfort over the relationship, and understanding, finally, all the way down, that there was nothing more I could have said that would have changed that. Marcus found me on the deck an hour after they left, still sitting in the dark, and he didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance the way some people do when they don't know what else to offer. He just sat down next to me and said, "You didn't do anything wrong in there. You said the truth as gently as it could be said." I told him I knew that, logically, but that knowing it and feeling it settle into your chest were two very different things, especially when the person asking was your own father, 63 years old, his voice cracking in a way I'd genuinely never heard before that night. Marcus didn't argue with that either. He just let me sit with it, the way Renata had taught him to let people sit with things instead of rushing to smooth them over, and eventually the tightness in my chest loosened enough that I could breathe normally again. I called Farah the following Monday to tell her how the visit had gone, and she listened without interrupting, the same way she had in our very first meeting. When I finished, she said something that stuck with me for the following 2 months. "Bella, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this doesn't end with a conversation. People who are this financially desperate and who already believe, on some level, that you owe them access to that money, sometimes escalate rather than accept a no. I want you to keep documenting everything, and I want you to make sure Walter and the bank both understand that any future authorization request needs to go through you directly, no exceptions, no matter what documentation accompanies it." I told her I already had the enhanced protocol in place. She said, "Good. Keep it that way. And Bella, if something does happen, don't hesitate. Call me immediately, day or night." I didn't fully understand at the time how right she'd turn out to be, but I followed her instructions anyway, because 2 years of estrangement had at least taught me to trust the people who'd earned it. I thought, for a while, that August 9th was the end of it. I was wrong. Farah had warned me, back in May, that people cornered by debt rarely stop at the first refusal, and she was right in a way I didn't fully appreciate until October. On October 9th, 2025, at 3:47 in the afternoon, I got a call from Walter Griggs, Cresmont's plan administrator, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Bella, I need you to call me back immediately. There's an issue with an authorization request on the trust." 15 minutes later, I was on the phone with Priya Anand at the bank, who walked me through exactly what had happened. A transfer request for $340,000, the full balance, submitted that afternoon with a signature purporting to be mine, caught instantly by the enhanced authentication protocol I'd requested back in May. The one that required direct phone or in-person confirmation from me for any transfer above the routine threshold. The signature doesn't match your specimen, Priya told me. Not even close, honestly, once you look for it. Whoever did this used an old signature as a reference, but the pressure points and letter formation are wrong throughout. I've already flagged it as a suspected forgery attempt. Given the amount and the trustee relationship involved, this is going to need to be formally reported. I asked who had submitted the form. Priya paused, the careful pause of someone about to tell you something they know will hurt, and said, "It came in with your sister as the submitting party, using power of attorney documentation that appears to also be falsified, since no such POA exists on file for this account." I didn't feel shock the way I might have 2 years earlier. I felt something closer to a grim, exhausted confirmation, the kind you feel when a diagnosis you suspected finally gets confirmed on paper. I thanked Priya, told her I'd need copies of everything for my attorney, and hung up. Then I called Farah, and then I drove, not to Millbrook Falls, but to the bank itself, because Priya had mentioned Chloe was still in the building, waiting to see if the transfer had gone through. The drive to the bank took 18 minutes, and I spent most of it in a strange, focused calm that surprised me even as I felt it happening. I thought about the binder, sitting at home in my desk drawer, 3 inches thick now, every page of it evidence I'd collected not out of paranoia but out of the same instinct that had made me good at my job for over a decade, the instinct to document, to verify, to never rely on memory alone when something mattered this much. I thought about Farah's voice on the phone 20 minutes earlier, steady and precise. "This is exactly the scenario we prepared for, Bella. You don't need to improvise anything. Just let the process do what it's designed to do." I thought, too, about Renata's line from that first dinner, over a year earlier. "Do you understand the power that gives you, whether you asked for it or not?" I understood it now, completely, in a way I hadn't when she first said it. I found her in the small waiting area near the compliance office, and I watched, through the glass, the exact moment the compliance officer told her the signature had already been flagged, the exact moment her face shifted from confidence to confusion to something close to panic. I walked in a few minutes later, after Priya had already begun the formal documentation process, and Chloe looked up at me from her chair, and for just a second, before she could rebuild whatever composure she'd walked in with, I saw something genuinely unguarded in her face. Fear, yes, but underneath it, something that looked almost like relief, like some small part of her had known this would fail and was almost grateful to be caught before it went further. "Bella," she said, standing too fast, knocking her purse off her lap. "I can explain. You forged my signature on a $340,000 pension transfer," I said, not unkindly, but not softly either. There's not a version of that sentence that has an innocent explanation. She sat back down, and for a moment I watched her hand shake, actually shake, in a way I'd never seen from Chloe, who had spent her whole life performing a kind of breezy confidence even when things were falling apart around her. "I didn't think it would actually go through," she said, quieter now, the performance gone. "I thought maybe it would just get flagged and someone would call you and you'd finally just, I don't know, finally just say yes, because it would already be moving. I didn't think about what happens if it doesn't work like that." She looked up at me, and her voice cracked slightly. "Mom said it would be fine. She said you'd never actually let it become a real problem for me. She said you always fix things." I reached into my bag and pulled out the binder. Not the whole thing, just a single folder I'd pulled from it that morning after Farah's call, anticipating exactly this conversation. I set it on the small table between us and opened it to the printed screenshot from the group chat, the one where our mother called me useful, the one where she'd said I was still trustee, like that was a resource to be extracted rather than a relationship to be repaired. I slid it across to her. "I don't fix things anymore, Chloe," I said. "Not when fixing them means erasing the consequences of choices other people made without me. This isn't me being cruel. This is me finally understanding the difference between being helpful and being used." She read the screenshot slowly, and something in her face changed as she did, a kind of recognition settling in that I don't think she'd let herself feel before, not fully. "She really said that," Chloe said quietly. "Useful." She set the paper down, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were wet, but she wasn't performing anymore, and that made it land differently than anything she'd said to me in 2 years. I'm not going to pretend I didn't do this because of what she said. I did it because I panicked, and because some part of me has always believed you'd absorb it, whatever it was, because you always have. But I know that's not an excuse. I know what I did. She paused. I'm not asking you to drop it. I don't think I even want you to, honestly. I think I need something to actually stop me for once. I didn't tell her, that day, that I'd already decided not to press criminal charges, though Farah had made clear I had every right to. I let that sit unresolved between us for a while, because some things shouldn't be resolved too quickly to feel real. What I did instead, over the following weeks, was work with Farah and Walter to formalize a report to the bank's fraud division for internal record purposes, a necessary step to protect the trust and my own fiduciary standing, while declining to pursue separate criminal prosecution against my sister specifically. Farah walked me through the decision carefully, laying out both paths without pushing me toward either one. You have every right to let this go through the criminal system, she told me. But you also have the right to decide that the accountability you actually want looks different than a courtroom. Just make sure whatever you choose it for yourself, not out of guilt. I thought about that for 3 days before I made the call, and in the end, it wasn't mercy exactly that drove the decision. It was the recognition that Chloe, for the first time in her life, had looked genuinely afraid of consequences instead of expecting someone to erase them, and I wanted to see what she'd do with that fear if it was allowed to actually matter. Cresmont's larger financial unraveling, though, moved forward with its own momentum, entirely separate from anything I did or didn't do. Unable to secure the pension funds and unable to renegotiate terms with Yorkfield Supply, my father made the decision, in November 2025, to file for a structured business wind-down, selling off remaining inventory and equipment to satisfy creditors, closing Cresmont Fastening Solutions after 37 years. The warehouse on Route 9 that had been my father's entire adult identity, the one I used to visit as a kid and watch him walk the floor between rows of steel fasteners like a general inspecting troops, was sold to a regional logistics company in January 2026 for a fraction of what it would have been worth 5 years earlier. The house on Larkspur Lane, weighed down by 2 mortgages, went up for sale the same month as the warehouse closure. My parents moved into a smaller rental property on the edge of town, a modest 2-bedroom unit with none of the space or history of the house I grew up in. None of that was my doing. It was the arithmetic of choices made over years, finally coming due, exactly the way Farah had predicted it would, whether I authorized the transfer or not. My mother has not spoken to me since October 9th. I've made my peace with that, more completely than I expected to. I won't pretend there aren't still moments, a certain kind of morning light in the kitchen, the smell of pot roast somewhere in a restaurant, that catch me off guard and pull me back to Larkspur Lane for a second before I remember where I actually am now. But those moments pass faster each time, and they no longer come with the ache they used to carry. My father called once, in December, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, and said only, "I understand why you couldn't help. I wish things had been different a long time before this." I told him I did too, and that the door wasn't closed on my end, just not open the way it used to be. We've spoken twice more since then, brief, careful calls, neither of us quite sure yet what the new shape of this relationship is supposed to look like, both of us, I think, willing to find out slowly instead of forcing it back into something it can't honestly be anymore. He mentioned, in the second call, that he'd started doing some part-time consulting for a smaller fastener distributor 2 towns over, nothing close to what Cresmont had been, but something, and I could hear in his voice that starting over at 63 was humbling him in ways 37 years of running his own company never had. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel the urge to. I just told him I was glad he'd found something, and I meant it. Chloe, though, has called every few weeks since the bank, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to tell me about a budgeting class she started taking through a community credit counseling nonprofit in Harrisburg, once to tell me she'd gotten a real job, full-time, at a logistics company outside the city, $38,000 a year, nothing glamorous, but hers, earned without anyone bailing her out. In January 2026, she sent me a photo of her first pay stub with the caption, "First one I didn't need anyone's help getting," and I sat with that message for a long time before I responded, because I understood exactly what it had cost her, in pride and in fear, to send it. I don't know yet what our relationship will become. I know it's the first honest conversation we've had since we were teenagers, and for now, that's enough. Here's what I want you to take away from this, because I've thought about how to say it for a long time, and I don't want to give you some tired line you've already heard 100 times on channels like this one. Being the responsible one in a family isn't a character trait people admire in you. It's a role they assign you so they don't have to examine their own choices. You are allowed to stop playing it. You are allowed to hold power, financial or otherwise, and use it to protect yourself instead of quietly absorbing everyone else's consequences for the rest of your life. Loving your family and refusing to be their safety net at your own expense are not opposites. Sometimes the second one is actually the truest form of the first, because it forces everyone, finally, to be honest about what they're capable of standing on their own. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe, because there are more stories like Bella's coming. Drop a comment and tell me what part hit hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear that saying no doesn't make you the villain of your own family's story. Thank you for staying with me through all 4 parts. I'll see you in the next one.